feistiest witch of them all. Are you there?
Yeah.
Is there an echo? Or is that just
There
me?
is.
Right, I better turn the sound down a little bit. Is that better?
Yeah, I can't hear myself now.
Fantastic. Look what I made. I made a potion.
Oh, that looks gross.
It is bloody lush. It's good.
Yeah, whatever.
It's going to make me ever so happy for tonight. So let's call it a performance, shall we?
It's definitely a performance. You are a performer.
Well, thank you.
24 hours, 7 days a week.
I do try. Look, you can see the gunk that's left in the bottom. See?
Gross.
It's got special herbs in there. I made that myself.
Okay.
Right. This ain't a potion making session. We are talking about books, I think. Sacred books of magic, Mr. Chris. Sacred books of magic. Do you have a sacred book of magic? And by the way,
no.
you need to fucking cheer up. Someone's told you need to cheer up.
Me, I'm fine. I've had a lovely day of consultations. I've had a not so nice day of technology.
Ah, yes, the technology. It's a bit buggy, isn't it, at the moment?
It's turned on me today, and I'm not quite sure why. Well, other than that thing we talked about the other week, Liam, where I seem to be overexpressing Mercury, but that could have something to do with something. But no, magical books, Liam, I don't have any.
Sacred
well,
book.
Oh,
what's
sacred
a sacred book to you? You're a magical practitioner, so although it might not be a magical book, surely there's books that are sacred to you.
No, they're all replaceable.
Not even like something with some family sentiment or something like that? Have you been passed down one of those family Bibles or anything like that?
I haven't got any family. Well, I do have a family Bible. You know I have a family Bible. But it's a weird one. It's not like one of those big expensive ones that you've got. It's one that's a cartoon script one. So it's kind of stories from the Bible as opposed to.
You've got a cartoon family Bible. What does that tell us about your family?
Yeah.
So, sacred books.
Yeah, Liam, look. You see?
Oh, look, we'll make the screen bigger. Let's have a look. Oh.
Shall I find you some Genesis? Would that make you happy?
I love a bit of Genesis. Give us the first little bit. Let us make man in our image or something like that, I think it says.
Here you go. There's a snake and everything.
Oh.
The interesting thing is they both look like they're from like Roy Lichtenstein stories.
That is a very interesting family Bible. I'm not going to lie. It's quite different. Someone's chimed in and said that the book that is sacred to them is Agrippa. Agrippa is sacred to them. I wonder if Agrippa was sacred to this person before we started making Agrippa cool again, Chris. Because I do rather think we've probably sold a fair few copies since we've been in the biz.
Yeah.
And
do you know what's scary about that?
We've probably got people to illegally download even more.
The scary thing about that means more money for Llewellyn. So are they the winners in the end?
I don't think they're the winners. They're massive losers. But I may or may not have given away the Llewellyn PDF.
Oh, I may have done the same too. But let's not talk about too much about that on YouTube, where they might have an ear or two.
So we have got to be careful with this YouTube. Like, I'm not sure whether the Fausty Witches can continue on YouTube. We may just have to stick with Facebook. Depends how many more strikes we get. There's 3 strikes and you're out. We can only afford to have 2 strikes, right? So, sacred books of magic must contain some sort of magic. Your Bible, cartoon Bible, technically it contains some magic and stuff like that, and it's sacred. Bible's quite a good one. Other sacred texts, sacred books. I suppose, are just what magical texts that are held in high regard.
Yeah, it's one way to put it.
Does anyone have to have killed for the book for it to be sacred?
No. Like you say, I think any book that's held in high regard. I have quite a few books, as you well know, and as you have all seen. But it's just kind of one of those. It's one of those things. I don't know. I don't necessarily feel I need them to exist, but they have been an important part of my story. For a bit of a pun there.
I see what you did, yes. When does a book, magical book, become sacred? Because there are some books which, particularly if you're thinking of ones that are passed down through families and covens and stuff like that, like journal type books that someone creates. When does it start becoming sacred? Because if someone, as many people will, create these little journals, magical books of shadows, that kind of thing. When do you think that starts becoming sacred? Does it start becoming sacred from the first little bit of writing or pictures that they put in that book? Or is it when it starts to become irreplaceable, or what?
Yeah, I think it kind of, because at the second it becomes, and I'm going to use this word again that I've used too many times already today, kind of ritual. It's kind of that part of the second it becomes needed, and then it suddenly becomes something that isn't replaceable, in the sense that, do you know? So that it has that kind of, what was that advert, Liam? Was it for MasterCard that you say, like, £700 for this holiday, £200 for the Ray-Bans, a good time, priceless. Do you remember?
Oh, it sounds like the sort of crap they'd come out with. For everything else, there's MasterCard, I think it is.
Yeah, something like that.
The sort of crap financial services would come out with. Trying to put a price on something you cannot put a price on.
And I think that's where sacred comes. I think that kind of, it is something that, and yes, this will upset all the religious folk, but the point is, I think it has that, you can't put a price on it, that you can't put a value to it, has a certain level of sacred to it. I suppose for the religious lot, sacred is a word that they think should be reserved for things of religious nature, I guess, such as a sacred act, or an idol, or a fossilized shit of that Jesus took. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, there's that kind of relics aspect of sacred, or there's that taking the ritual word again, and using it down to vestments. I think the word sacred would be applied to these kind of, and I don't mean those kind of velour or velvet ones that the Wiccans wear, but kind of like the idea of putting on, like, to me, the idea of lucky pants, is there's a certain level of sacred to that, that kind of sits somewhere between superstition and sacred. That kind of like, when someone has a lucky jock that they have to wear each time that they go to win a game, because they've got that kind of history of going, well, no, I can't replace this one because I've won every game I've worn it for. Like, do you know what I mean?
Pants, when you go out on the pool and you wear your pants, your fancy Andrew Christians. Do you wash them in between?
Obviously.
Right, so they're allowed to wash the lucky jock in between games, are they?
But some people wouldn't. Like, some people would have that aspect, wouldn't they, of kind of going, these are so important that I can't risk washing off the look. Particularly with lucky items, I think some people don't clean or do anything to those.
Well, yeah, I guess. Whenever I've been asked to sell my underwear to creepy people on apps, They've always preferred it to be unwashed.
Wow, Liam. Here's me talking about worrying about the religious lot not liking me misusing the word sacred, and you go talking about selling your underwear to dirty pervs on Grindr. Like, come on.
There's magic in that, Chris. I mean it money from nothing. Right, so would you say then that if a book or text is sacred, is because it somehow provokes an emotional response in people? So if you were to get a book, I don't know, Katie Price Jordan's latest autobiography that she probably didn't write, if I was to burn that book, probably even Katie Price herself probably wouldn't care, would she? A lot of people wouldn't really care. But if I was to suddenly, I don't know, get a Quran or something like that, a lot of people would be quite upset with that. There would be a lot of emotional response.
Yeah. Attachment, I think, is the word we often use.
Emotional attachment to a text. Now, people are all individuals, and people can form emotional attachments to, let's just say, texts and books for many reasons. Magical practitioners. Why do you think magical practitioners get attached to books? And then we'll probably go to a question, because we've got questions come in. And also I've been told to OMG, behave. So I don't know what I said there. But
that was you talking about pervs.
They are right there, Chris. They are right there.
They are. But yeah, so to kind of answer your question and try and not give you too much air of, because they probably do need airing, Liam, to be quite fair. I've lost my train of thought now, jabbing at you.
You have religious people, obviously, that are very attached to texts and stuff, but the pure
attachment.
What would a magic person, why would they attach to a text? Because there's someone that's actually wrote a question that may be along the same sort of lines potentially. But I want to jump in with just the broad ideas from you as to why a magical practitioner that's not necessarily religious might think that if they're not part of a religion or anything, why would they think a text is sacred, maybe?
A lot of it, again, will come down to that word ritual. Like with tools, I think as people kind of, I have, for example, a crock pot that I only use for dyeing. Now, I use that only for dyeing because it's a safety thing. I don't want to accidentally poison someone with a chicken chasseur because it's got heavy metals in it, residue from when I've gone and done some natural dyeing. So, like there is a part of it that comes down to
dyeing, or do you mean killing, like that big wok you will cremate the babies in?
No. I'm talking about dyeing, as in extracting color. I have a whole different crock pot and wok for eating babies. But the point is that there is part of it that comes down to use, doesn't it? The utility of it. That, I'm not going to ruin that perfectly white thing with something that's very messy, or or I'll split the uses of something I use for magical purpose to something I use for the mundane usage. So, the main reason for that, again, will often be, well, I don't really want to be mixing food or grinding down the herbs for bolognese in the same can't use my words now, mortar and pestle that I used for the belladonna last week, unless I really don't like the in-laws that are coming for tea. Like, you've got to be careful with belladonna because it is one of the things they will check during autopsy. So, so it's kind of like, it's one of those that you'll separate things for purpose, I think, is a very human thing to do. We're not the only ones that do it. Pigs have separate areas of their sty that they will eat in one area, shit in another, and sleep in another. They're very clean animals, funnily enough. But, you know, there is that kind of habit or ritual in why we use things for certain purposes. And then I think as a practitioner, a lot of people, not myself particularly, but there are lots of people that will use those same things again and again and again for specific uses. And you know, if you water that down to the nth degree, you'll get kind of the Wiccan end, where you've got, you know, an athame that's there for doing positive work, and a Bolin, I think they call it, for their more nefarious works, or it might be the other way around. I can never remember. One's black, one's white. But having kind of color-coded ritual items that you use, you know, we could quite easily... Oh, we've lost Liam. We could quite easily, just to finish my thought, you could get to the point where you would separate the uses of different books. So the obvious one for that is what people call a Book of Shadows versus the grimoire tradition. So, you know, a Book of Shadows is often a personal journey. Those are words, whereas gnosis is normally put into the grimoire. So that's where you would put the kind of, you know, magical ingredients, etc., of use it. Whereas a Book of Shadows traditionally was used in order to do exactly what it says on the tin, which is put in those kind of parts of you, those kind of shadow thoughts that are personal to your individual understanding of how you practice. So that, you know, so traditionally from that point of view, you'd have the Book of Shadows was the journal. It was the sharing of yourself, whereas the grimoire was about the actual nitty gritty of how does it get done, the kind of workbook that kind of puts down the calculations. Is you back? I don't know what bits you heard of that, but I just kind of thought I'd go off on one about, while we're talking about sacred books, the difference between traditionally the difference between a BOS versus a grimoire.
Oh, Book of Shadows and stuff like that. Sorry.
Yeah.
My phone, I was on my phone and the phone's just said that there's temperature warning. It's got very upset.
It's got too hot.
I've been on it literally for hours, so it's
yeah,
boiled over quite literally. Did you answer Jason's question?
I haven't answered questions yet, but I'm hoping that will slip straight in.
So Jason asks, where would you classify books that were purposefully consecrated / cursed as part of some kind of work-in? So magically infused books, I suppose you could say. They could be sacred. I mean, they could be meaningful to a person. But at the same time, if you were to curse a book or put a lot of nasty stuff into the book and then get rid of the book, is that sacred? Maybe it's sacred to the person that you stuck in that book or soul you attached to that book.
As
or
it's now
spirit,
their house.
You know, given that it's now their new vessel. But I mean, it is one of those things. It all comes down to, I think, the individual and or a group of people that care about a book. Like I've met magicians, magical practitioners that really don't care about their notebooks. They don't get fancy notebooks. Our friend Lady Poison, she don't go and get fancy notebooks to write in. She just gets the free stuff that she gets given it, I don't know, financial service conventions and shit like that, you know? I like those fancy, nice books, but the problem with them is that I like to take them and I like to go through notes. So for me, it's a case of, okay, I've got loads of notes that I've put on my phone. I've got stuff that I've put on my computer. There's stuff on the Google Docs drive. There's stuff on, you know, little notebooks and stuff like that. I like to kind of have a cull every now and then and put, okay, what are all of the things that I realistically want to care about and where do I put this? I'll put it in a book traditionally. Which nowadays I just put in a Google Docs. You know, for me, I don't really write things down. In terms of sacred books that I've personally worked on, that would I get rid of or would I not get rid of? There's probably only one book. There's one book that I've got. It's in the cabinet. Okay, I think it's in the cabinet. It may not be in the cabinet. No, it is in the cabinet. I normally shove it right at the back. It's this one. Okay, A4 notebook. Nothing inherently special about it. It was a present that I was given probably about 15 odd years ago now. Actually, I would imagine it's older than that. That is a magical tradition that I was asked to, I suppose, write down, time capsule it. So what I had to do is on the Saturday, it took till Saturday to Monday to listen to a person dictate and talk about their whole magical tradition. And I put that down to safeguard it in this book, which I'll end up giving it to someone someday. You know, it's not like it's sacred to me, but when I look at this book, it would be sacred to a lot of would-be witches. They would probably, there's a lot of people that if I was to auction this up, there'd be a fair amount of money wanting to be spent on this because it is notes from a tradition potentially defunct. But from my perspective, I look at it and I think, oh my gosh, my wrist starts to strain at hours upon end writing down. So I look and I look hard work. Would I want to throw it away? No, I wouldn't want to throw it away. For me, it's a kind of a magical story and a book that has a journey that's just currently with me, but will be eventually passed along. But I don't really use it. I flipped for it every now and then. Interesting. That's kind of like, to a certain extent, is it consecrated? Is it not consecrated? Well, it's not consecrated, but it's got a hell of a lot of effort put into that during sealed in a room for what amounts to over 24 hours, you know? There's some magical infusions, no doubt, in it.
No, I think what's interesting about what you say there is more about the fact that what makes something sacred, because essentially the book isn't sacred in essence, because it's like you say, there is nothing special about the book. What's interesting is the words themselves were somewhat sacred to the person that dictated them to you, and they would possibly be somewhat sacred to the person that receives them on the other end, whoever the lucky bidder is, I guess. But ultimately that's where that kind of priceless aspect becomes a bit of an issue, of something is only worth what someone's willing to pay for it. I think what's interesting about sacred will often come down to that, won't it, in the sense of whose words are they, or where of those words, because obviously both of us have channeled various books that we use for personal gnosis, or of, like what you're talking about there, dictated for somebody else's use in the future, but was, you know, part of an agreement with certain deities or whatever, in order to make sure that things were handed on. You know, a lot of what we do in terms of consultation work is channeled work. I suppose for us it's tricky because the words are useful and utilitarian, but I don't know whether or not either of us would ever call them sacred, which I think is a tricky concept when you think sort of channeled words. For a lot of people, they think of kind of priesthood or deities in that kind of religious setting, whereas actually we probably do more channeled work in a week than most people would ever think of doing in an entire lifetime. But hold no sacredness for us.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't float your boat, does it? This book doesn't really float my boat. Will I give it out? I probably won't. I'm not going to put this up for auction, because the thing is, this was given to me. I wrote it. It's my words, essentially. But it was someone that was, you talked about channeling. I had to sit with someone that was possessed. If you've ever sat with someone that's been possessed for a considerable amount of time, you'll know what a strain it takes on the body. So there's all sorts of stories there, but for me, because of the way my mind works, is the case I can't just give this out like this. If I was to give it out, I'd have to reformulate, I'd have to put contents page in. Like there's stuff that the book's kind of sideways. So we read from right to left, right? This book goes from left, right, goes from right page to left, right? So it's kind of fucking weird. But there we go. I can't cope with that. I've got to put this down. I actually bought a sketchbook because this is one of the things. If I put a lot of effort into a project to produce a single book, I would probably put it in a sketchbook and do a nice job, right? Like these old-fashioned books of shadows. When does that ever happen? It never fucking happens. But that's the sort of person I am, that if I was to produce something like this and put it in something else, I wouldn't be happy with the basic notes, you know. But I mean, sacred books, I personally don't have any sacred books. Chris, I don't think you have any sacred books, but I think we both recognize when books are sacred to others, like the Bible, for example. We understand that that's a sacred text to a lot of people. At the same time, we know that the correspondence list, that I suppose you could call as a book from certain people, published by Llewellyn, may be sacred to other people, you know? It's one of those things. Sacred books of magic mean nothing to me because I don't have a sacred book of magic, but I can sympathize with someone. When it comes to reading magical books, however, I think that's ultimately probably more of an interesting conversation, because people will talk about sacred magic texts and stuff. There's that sacred text website which you can download reams and reams and reams. A lot of people will think, I'm going to get that book, I'm going to buy that book, or I'm going to download the PDF of that book or Kindle edition of that book because it's sacred. This, I'd say, is an interesting discussion, because just because someone else thinks it's sacred, does it mean that it's really actually realistically worth the paper it's written on? A lot of the time I would say no. And if it is super amazingly cool and amazing, is that person even going to get anything out of it? I mean,
well, that kind of brings up the idea of, you know, in terms of power, if we're switching from talking about sacred books to talking about books of power, that's different. And I think those two things have to be quite clearly put apart. You know, the same way that I will say, you know, there are lots of books behind me that I consider to be important and really great. You know, the works of Aristotle and Thucydides and things like that, that I consider to be great works of, you know, literary art form. But ultimately, I don't consider them to be sacred. You know, I think there is a certain part of, you know, that emotional attachment that is specific to something that is sacred. Whereas, you know, a lot of these behind me are my favourites and have been given about a lot. I think what's important to kind of bring up in the terms of, because they kind of separate the two, but also bring the two together, of kind of sacred and, you know, master works or whatever you want to call them, kind of goes with what Ariella's talking about here, where she says, as an author, and that's the bit I kind of want to hold on, is the author. So put my energy into books, and those four is linked to me. I think spell books can be the same, their energy. So it's the authorship that I kind of want to focus on there, which is what makes that something sacred or something to be their favorite or useful or powerful, is going to be down to that, is how much credence or, you know, love, support, admiration do you have for the author? Because obviously that's where a lot of these religious texts come from, is the kind of the authority that comes from those words, and a belief in those words being from deity or from somebody of importance. You know, I'm sure somebody has got a book of quotations from the Dalai Lama at home. Like, there is that kind of authorship that kind of comes from it. You know, and the same is possible of the critiques. You know, often you can imagine there'll be people that listen to us on our little Fausty show or the Not a Book review, who from our critiques of them have a different attachment to different books that may have been affected. You know, I imagine there are lots of fiction books out there that have only sold because of their Oprah sticker, Oprah Book Club sticker on the front. Like there is that kind of aspect of authorship and what people think of said authors. I won't go much further with that because we'll end up in J.K. Rowling territory and that just bores me. But the of kind of separating the art from the artist, but I won't go there. It's more about that kind of authorship. So again, that goes back to what you've just done, which is you may have written and actually put those words down, but in order for them to actually be understood, because the book was translated, and this is where I think it's important for me, is the book was written down by you. So there are many options of, because I don't know if it was a pure dictation in the sense that you wrote.
It is too much to keep up with it. It's too much to keep up with it. It's my shorthand, essentially.
Yeah, which means then when you were to then republish that, if you were to, it would be your understanding of somebody's channeled words, at which point the authorship kind of then transfers from that person, that deity or demon or whatever it was that was being channeled from the possessed work, is then going to transfer from being their authorship to being your authorship, which is where the trickiness comes with certain religious texts. You know, the closest I have to those religious texts will be, you know, Thucydides or Herodotus. And again, I'm still resisted on the fact that I'm aware of that authorship change, because that's somebody's translation of a translation of a translation, which is where we've talked about magical text before and kind of going, well, those images are there, those drawings are there, but whose drawings are they? Is that purely your representation of what was channeled? You know, because obviously you get a lot of occultists, don't you, who turn around and say, these are the words of, and they are words of power because, and you're kind of like, okay, but were you there? Were those the words that were spoken to you? Or have you used somebody else's transliteration? Or is that a translation of a translation of some ritual that happened 400 years ago? Who wrote them down first? And whose actual words are we looking at? And what is your actual understanding of those words? Which is where it all gets tricky for me. But sorry, I've rambled on now. I suppose we should cover other things. Deanna says about having a book of practice. I think this is back when I was talking about the difference between a book of shadows and a grimoire, where she says she's got written her own book of her own practice, which, you know, some would consider a book of shadows or whatever. That will not be shared with anyone. And I do recommend, like she personally recommends that people do it. The bit I kind of want to bring up there, Liam, and want to hear your opinion on is obviously
would she die? It will happen.
No, I haven't written books in a very long time. I'm talking probably my early teens, 11, 12, 13.
Oh, I thought we were talking cuneiform.
Oh, no, I don't mean those. Those are different problems.
You used to write on tablets. And kids, we're not talking iPads.
Nice big slabs of granite.
It's funny how it all comes back round again, doesn't it?
It does.
It's like fashion.
Is that kind of... Do you find that as you have progressed, that you write less? So I actually forget to write things down unless it's on like a scrap of paper where I'm figuring something out, like a little doodle or whatever, where I'm trying to figure something out.
I don't really write notes now. What I do have to do is, just because of the nature of time, is to put down a project and pick it up when you're mid-flow. So for me, it's not about putting something down that actually necessarily makes sense. What it is to me is putting something down as a kind of bookmark for where I was on an energy stream. So this is my current notebook, right? In this current notebook, it's got a lot of picture-y things in it, right? Because I take this notebook and it's got important kind of pictures and shit like that in, which I was using when I was teaching, right? So we would have things like this and that in like handouts. So when I'm explaining and talking to someone, it would have that in. This would just travel around with me. So the last thing that I worked on in here, oh look, we've got the Cunning Man's cabinet. Plans for it. There's notes, there's a notebook, but ultimately it's also got my project that I was working on for Kythe, right? Kythe project. Which is several pages.
See, mine, Liam, aren't even, and that's the limit of what you could even call organised, really. The absolute bottom line of organised there. That's what I'm kind of talking about. Mine don't even tend to be in books. They'll be on like scraps of paper. And then occasionally I'll pick a book up that I was clearly reading at the time, and papers fall out of it where I've literally like doodled something.
Oh, there's a lot of that. I have to put them in this book. When I get a piece of paper, I'll put it in this book, and that's why I can't put it upside down without catching hold of it, because it all just falls out. But then it will be additions. So with the Kythe, put that on. We got our next edition of that. So when I picked it back up again, I was like, okay, we got to finish on something that's a little bit neater. Right, so it's basically a rethinking, so I can constantly put it down, because I've got to do energies, I've also got ingredients, and I've got planetary energies and days and hours and all that sort of thing. That's really difficult for me to keep in my head, so I put that down as shorthand to look at it so that I don't lose it in my mind, particularly when you're picking things up and putting things down. But that's the closest thing to it. I took this to a certain place to steal recipes, which I put recipes in. So that was also useful. But most of the time for memory jogging, I think I copy what you do as well, which is to take pictures on the phone. My pictures on my phone is just like random crap, but it will remind me of something. That I can then go back to it later.
I've saved so much time in my life since the smartphone occurred, because the amount of times I spent in my youth copying like a little scribe over and over again, bits of information. And like I say, my very early teens would be copying things from one book to another in order to put them in the right order, because I was fixated with that things had to be kind of categorized. But you know, it's one of those things where you're just kind of like, shit. Now I look at them and I kind of go, these are pointless, and I wouldn't even give them to somebody else. If anything, I'd probably just, at some point when the Alzheimer's starts kicking in, I'll probably just burn them.
Well, that's what I think it was Cecil Williamson did. That's what happened to Cecil Williamson stuff. So the guy that was did the Witchcraft Museum in Boscastle, he had obviously loads of interviews, loads of papers from all of this magical lore, all of these spells, all of that sort of thing. Only a small part of it exists. A lot of it got burnt when he died. So there's so much of all of the stuff that he was also famous in saying, I'm sure he said that he was going, like when someone asks him, what are you going to do with all these notes? What are you going to do with your entire life, essentially revolving around collecting magical lore? Oh, when I die, I'll probably just burn it. some of it still exists, but a lot of it doesn't, because that's exactly kind of what happened. I think it was the family ended up burning it or something like that. But what about Diana's books then? So she's got her personal magical journals. I wonder what Diana would think about family or friends or whatever stealing those journals. So maybe she wants to be better, or maybe she just wants them to be destroyed. But what if someone just says, "Oh, I think I'll just take those"? You know, have you ever found anyone take magical journals of another practitioner without permission, or have you ever done that yourself, Chris? Or what is your ethics and morality surrounding such practices?
Well, my judgment would mostly be on archaeologists, but luckily they can't read what they're actually taking drawings and pictures of. But the no is the short answer. I think is yes. I know of witches that have stolen other people's notes and other people's writings, or Llewellyn, where they rip off everybody and then water it down. But actually, my interest in it, not so much. I like talking to people about practice, but more to just kind of, wash things around in your brain and make sure that, you feel like you're contributing somehow, shape or form. But, right. We've just been given a minute or so, a very judgy, because that's how I'm receiving it, Katie Veronica. Rolling eyes, check at the 38 minutes point. So I don't know if that means she doesn't feel she's found anything useful so far. I don't know.
I don't know what that's supposed to mean.
But I'll jump through a few comments that we've kind of not dealt with yet. So Jason said, interestingly, a book you invested a lot of energy into that has a story and a purpose. I think he's excited about your picked up channeled working there. Michelle has said, among famous occult books, what would you say that makes them sacred, or so many others do? Is it just the fact that someone actually wrote something down that was risky, what the content really produces something? And did those sacred books get published by authors themselves, and why would they do that? There's a lot to unpack there, but have a go.
Greed.
Yeah.
That's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say greed. So sacred books, if you've ever taken a magician or a bunch of witches to a second-hand bookshop, right, and there's some magical books in amongst them, it's like watching a kid in a candy shop. They just want to grab, right? Because what they're looking for are magical practitioners that are so inclined to evolve and, venture further down the path. Is they're kind of, to a certain extent, desperate for something new. When you get to when you get further down your path, what you tend to find, or when you get to a decent magical level, foundational magical level, what you tend to find is there is nothing new at that point. You always look at people's journals, other magical works and stuff like that, mythology, and you look and you hope you're going to find something new. Generally, you don't find anything new. Genuinely, you find, oh, look, I've heard this before. It's similar to that. It's just expressed in a slightly different way. Or this is similar to that. Oh, isn't that interesting? I'm looking at it in a slightly different angle. So I would say that magpies, books in particular, knowledge, people from the occult background tend to be book magpies, always latching on to a book or a work to see what they can get to add to their own practice. What's quite interesting is that they generally, most of them, tend to just stick towards books. They'll see magical items and they'll see them as, that magical item has a history. Go to the Witchcraft Museum, oh, look, there's a puppet, or there's a sword that got used by some Wiccan magical artifact, part of history. John Dee's scrying, obsidian little mirror, must be important. Not really, not necessarily important at all. What people often fail to see is what they can learn from objects acts that are hold or attached to an energy, and not looking at it from what can I learn from what's written on it, what hieroglyphics are on it, or anything like that, but more of a case of reverse engineering. I see a lot less of that than I'd like to. I think the reverse engineering within the realms of magical practice is super important, and I think people learn so much more from it. Not taking a book and hoping that it's going to give you the answers. Instead, taking and looking at something and taking it apart and seeing how is it made, what does it do? Take this magical artifact that someone's got that they use. Is it a ring? Okay, so this woman, she's got this ring and she keeps doing something with it, and then something happens with the weather. How does that work? What's going on there? You know, yes, you could go and get a book on weather magic or magical objects or something like that. But if you were to take that, maybe she dies and you end up getting that ring, leaving it to you in the will or something like that, I don't know, or stealing it. Would you be able to reverse engineer what was going on there? You know, things like that. Knowledge. I see magpies, Chris. I think is the best answer to the question. Magpies. Magical magpies attracted to books with the little golden nuggets, panning for gold like at Legoland. They all want their little metal medal from panning for gold. And you waste entire lifetimes doing that.
It just reminds me of libraries, really. You've got those people I can't help but equate to librarians, really, which I love librarians. They can be very useful when you want something specific, you know, but they do kind of very close to kind of Library of Alexandria, kind of stealing books off everybody, collect everything, make a copy and then hide the original kind of situation. Katie Veronica jumps on and says it wasn't judgy, it was just there as an electronic post-it note. To make sure we were aware. It was a check-in, probably. Michelle says, so Liam, it might be more useful to see it as if you can get some energy rather than actual knowledge at that point. So, yeah, that's exactly what you're saying.
I'm thinking in terms of what I see is people, occultists are like magpies for books and knowledge and getting knowledge from books. What I would like to see is people get knowledge from things that are not books, not written down. Experimentation, viewing and watching others, there's less about that. I think a lot of witches nowadays would, rather than go and watch another person work, they would prefer to read the step-by-step ritual. Okay, there isn't a lot of exploration and throwing kind of anthropologists, I guess, would do that, study by doing and watching and that kind of thing. One thing I would say about magical books, because we've talked a lot so far today about books that retain energy and magically charged books, or books that are being created to be magical. What's your ideas and thoughts on curses put on books? Because I find that this idea, I see a lot of this, we've got some possible authors listening, the idea of cursing a book, particularly when it comes to copyright, such a crock of shit. I've seen so many people that would call themselves witches that publish all of these books and they'd gonna curse it from copyright fraud. And yeah, I've personally downloaded so many of these so-say copyrighted books and nothing bad's happened to me. Does that just show that because nothing's bad happened to me, that their work is not really worth reading? Because if they can't even come up with a basic curse for their own book, that they probably haven't got a lot to add? Or is that just me being nasty?
That's just you being Fausty, I think. But what I find strange is I find that is two opposing forces of wanting to share knowledge, but wanting to maintain ownership. That kind of, those two, you expecting that kind of curse to work is tricky in itself, which just kind of says where they are magically speaking. Because if they were worth it, they'd have been able to advance enough in order to actually, overcome that little slippery road that is. is the fact that kind of like, well, why are you sharing it? I suppose it's just me as a designer. That's the bit there that kind of goes, what do they say? Imitation is the highest form of flattery, something like that.
Yeah, they do say that.
So to me, I kind of like, well, okay, they may be able to try and do it, but they're never going to do it as well as I do. Is that kind of aspect that it has to come with it, I think myself. I don't see the point of copywriting things really anymore. Obviously, there is a tricky part with that when it comes to patenting. I think that's a very different practice where people are always out to make money off each other, back of somebody else's ideas. But ultimately, I think if you do it well, people will always come to you. The question will be whether or not that makes you a millionaire or just very popular. Is two very different things, but it's a tricky one. The
It's what you can do, what you can get away with doing. Ultimately, people talk about copywriting and stuff like that, and you can get on your high horse and stuff. But ultimately, if you can download the book on PDF, you can download the book on PDF. It can be done. I think that a lot of energy gets thrown at and authors and such being upset by, well, it's not right. It's not right to do that. It's immoral and unethical to do that. And I kind of think, right, but it's possible. Channel your energy into making it not possible or less possible, more difficult to do, rather than the idle threats and the pointless curses that get put in said books. I mean, if you're creating a magical book, the chances are the magically inclined people are going to be the ones that are reading it. They're probably going to be able to get rid of any kind of basic curse. So one of the reasons why I set as homework occasionally for people to do naughty stuff that upsets magical practitioners and stuff, like stealing pennies from a well. We got any more questions, Chris? There's one that's come up that I thought is not really a question, but quite amusing. Chris is so Venusian.
Oh, I skipped over that one. Sorry. No, I was going to kind of pick up what you just said, which is kind of that point of, I just don't see the point personally of going to that nth degree or getting pissed off about copywriting stuff, in the sense that things are available and people make things available as PDFs, but actually any true book lover, which, let's face it, a real collector, will always want one. So, you can guarantee that the people that are going to pay your bills are the ones that will always want a hard copy. But ultimately, somebody that can't afford to spend £60 or 100 or a couple of £1,000, some of them, believe it or not, aren't they, to actually get a copy, may learn enough to kind of go, actually, this was a really good book. And then suddenly you've got an entire audience you didn't know you were going to get. And that's because those people will have never have afforded to buy your book. However, if enough of them then turn around and said, this is a really good book and I need a copy, but I can't afford to spend, £2,000 on one, that's how kind of reprints and kind of facsimiles happen, is when something gets popular and has to be recreated at a cheaper rate to meet the need. But so there's a part of me that kind of goes, I don't think sharing PDFs and stuff around is necessarily a bad thing, as long as people are spending some money somewhere. So whether or not, because ultimately, I think you've got to try and get used to the fact that if it's digitally available, people are going to share it. Like,
Is there any danger with exploring texts in magical books? Because a lot of the para-nitwits you see on the television, I've seen them do this on that Most Haunted program and such, where they just willy-nilly get a grimoire or something like that, start reading out names and passages. I think particularly of that scene from The Mummy, you know?
No! You must not read from the book!
And then something bad happens just because they've read a chapter of the book or they've drawn some sigil or something like that. That's para nitwits and dabbling, you know. Realistically, in your experience, does negative things happen or bad people get themselves into bad situations just by studying a sacred text or a magical text or a book like that? How often does that realistically happen?
It's rare in my opinion and my experience. The main reason is because reading and understanding are two very different things. That's why there are normally separate test papers, one for reading and one for comprehension. So, you know, there is that kind of understanding, kind of go, okay, can I find information in a set book? That kind of information gathering is one skill. Actually understanding it is a very different skill. And when it comes down to magical practice, that I think that then goes to a whole new level of kind of going, well, I understand what it said. That doesn't mean I could actually do what it asked me to do or told me about. I think that one of my favorite scenes from The Mummy there. I'm so glad you actually found a way to shoehorn one of those in. Is this idea of words of power, which is one I struggle with, because there are very few words. That's not true. There are lots of words that have power. They don't all necessarily have magical power. And what people tend to forget is normally words because of where they're pulling them from. So from these grimoires and things like that, they are shorthand. You know, it goes back to that authorship part, going, okay, well, they've written the name Michael there, or or Gabriel, or whoever it is. Doesn't necessarily mean that's the word that was written on the floor, or that actually meant anything. It may have just been a reminder to go, oh shit, that's the bit where I call Michael in. And make sure that he's good. And then this one, I've then got to call in Uriel, and Uriel's got to do something. Then that really scary guy, Mammon's got to turn up. And you know what I mean? Like, so to some people, it's like, these might just be reminders of that. To me, writing down the word Michael would be reminder douche. Like, it would be probably a reminder to say, probably need to make sure I've got lots of rope handy. Because
watch
those
out
words
for Michael, like beware of the dog.
Yeah. Like, oh shit. That
flaming he's
sword,
going to interfere at some point, so we need to do something about that. That's kind of your take on that.
It's a reminder that you kind of like, oh, could have interference from, or need the protection of this at this point. Would totally depend on the practitioner, where they're at, and what their shorthand is. I've got into a habit at one point where I used a little that little maiden mother crone, like the moon and the two half moons, as the word that meant Wiccan. Like, so somebody might have read one of my doodle-ins and kind of gone, oh, at this point I must call in the goddess, the triple goddess, and kind of like, no, that meant get rid of that dickhead. He doesn't know anything. Do you know, like, so my shorthand would be completely different to the next 50 witches down the lot, walking down the street. And then you add in the layer of, this was a book written 1,000 years ago, or this was a book written 200 years ago. There's going to be context that is lost to you, even if you know he's Victorian or or he's Celtic. So kind of actually understanding that, again, like I feel like it's another level of several layers of complication beyond comprehension. But sorry, I turned that into a rant then, and I didn't mean to.
I think that a lot of people are worried about dabbling and with texts and things that are outside of their current level of understanding, because we get taught to play it safe, I think, a lot nowadays, wrap ourselves in cotton wool and such, when in reality magical practice, if it's not a danger from the beginning, it will be a danger at some point, because it is no different than the scientists, chemists and such eventually have to do an experiment. They can hypothesize and try and work out all the angles, but then they've actually got to do something, and something terrible might happen, like that rocket that you think should work theoretically ends up actually falling back down to Earth and blowing up, right? Yes, spirit attachments and stuff, things can happen. Yes, I know magical practitioners that have released books particularly specifically to cause trouble to dabblers and beginners, just because they're assholes, right? Does that mean it's likely to happen? I think you're more than likely going to get hit by a bus. And that's coming from someone that has been hit by a bus. I've been hit by a bus once. Long story. Than some sort of spirit attachment. So I'd say that to certain people, not to worry about opening up some book. It's not going to be like it is in The Mummy, where you open the book and there's a chill in the air and all that sort of thing, then something starts to happen. I think that from a serious magical practitioner's perspective, if you've got some common sense, you're not going to get some spirit over your shoulder or some shit like that ultimately. I put that one in for Chris. Can you remember that one? Chris. That really shit you up, didn't it?
Like, literally, as soon as the scene started, I'd already starting to get chills. You know how much I hate that.
But Chris, you're a super witch. Don't tell me a little old horror film kept you awake at night.
It triggers me on a soul level, and I'm still
creepy.
I'm still
There's
not
nothing else. All of the crazy ass magic you've been up to, all the crazy ass films and stuff like that, real demons and angels and spirits and that, and the only thing that's ever bothered you is that one scene from that one crappy film, Insidious.
Yeah. It's a really shit film.
I think there's some unresolved issues there, perhaps from your past. Maybe some hashtag deep shadow work needed.
No, it's not.
Do you need me to pause it, play it again and pause it so that you can do some now? No.
And if you play it again, I will hurt you.
Oh, this could be a new game we have on the Fausty Witches show.
No.
When can I insert evil demon thing? And will it shit Chris up enough? But anyway, I think we're out of time now anyway, Chris. But there we go. Have you got anything to add before I click the end transmission button? Or has anyone got any final questions or anything?
The only point I wanted to put, the only one in there that we won't deal with now, which will upset him even more. Jason was saying, I'm hoping Chris was going to go on a rant about the appropriation of ancient Egyptian magic.
We got a whole episode about that, Jason. We have an entire episode about that called Those Damn Ptolemies. So you can stay tuned for that. It is on the list.
You'll get that content.
I've got memes and stuff ready for that. I got videos, all sorts of stuff ready for that episode. But anyway. And then maybe, are we going to do one about KGB magic, Chris?
Maybe.
Maybe one about KGB magic?
Maybe.
We've missed one. KGB, or are you not allowed to tell us?
We've missed one. The KGB doesn't exist. Or does it?
Oh, right. Yeah, of course it doesn't.
Deanna's last comment there is, isn't it best to practice than to read?
Some people want a little bit of inspiration, so they'll buy a magical book, or one that I quite like, book of mythology, because you can get inspiration. You can think, oh, look, interesting concept here, interesting concept there, interesting picture, photograph. Thing. I shall open that up. I'll have a little dabble. I'll have a little see.
But ultimately, yeah, you're not going to get very far memorizing things. What you will get far is doing, because magical practice, something you have to practice. Witchcraft is a craft that needs to be done. You can read as many books about plastering as you need to, but you need to understand what it feels like to have a hawk in one hand and a trowel in the other, and the motions and stuff you've got to do. Yeah, in it.
There you go. I think we're done.
That's it. Right. Goodbye, everyone, and we will see you next week. I suppose I should play the outro, shouldn't I? That'd be good.